sort of jump in, and hopefully while I'm doing the boring bit of introductions, we'll get more people to join us, which is great. So good afternoon and welcome to our first BCO ESG webinars. It's the first of a series of webinars, but I think right at the top of the event, whilst there is continued awful news coming out of the East, Ukraine and the war with Russia, we did get some really good news today, which was Nazanin Zaghari, who actually is being released. So I thought that's just fantastic. Despite all the horrible news elsewhere, this small drop of light emerging was great, and along with her other Capti Asui, I think it was, I can't remember the proper name, but that's really good news. Anyway, diving into our first webinar, which is going to examine embedding social value into planning. This is one of a series of webinars we're running with the BCO ESG committee. We've actually got 5 themes this year, and we're going to work our way up to a BCO ESG conference that we're going to be running in September of 2023. So we've got 18 months worth of subject matter to cover, and we're going to, like today, covering social value. We're going to look at net zero as another theme. We're going to look at designing for sustainability as a third theme. We're going to examine what it means to be managing offices properly for well-being and sustainability. And the last theme we're going to be looking at is legislation and governance. I'm going to cover a range of issues during those themes and those webinars, of which there'll be about 12 or so, including impact investment, net zero pathways, what does good sustainable design look like, embodied carbon, rebuilding our high streets, facilities management, and then finally government reporting for real estate. So quite a few things we're going to be covering. So that's going to be exciting. So watch this space and we'll keep you informed. This is a subject that's really close to my heart, embedding social value into the planning process. Been working at it now for a good 18 months. And I think it cuts to the core of one of the issues, which is trust in planning. We do know that, interesting enough, that Grosvenor did a survey, and that showed that less than 2% of the public trusted developers to look after communities' interest. And that was a shocking enough number. The number that really shocked me was that less than 70% of the public trust the public sector, i.e. planning authorities, to look after their interests, which I find, even though it's a slightly high number, an even more shocking number. And that tells you the state of planning. Now, I think that social value can go somewhere in rebuilding that trust that has plainly built down. And the reason is that when you think about social value, you're talking about the contribution to communities. And we've done sort of some benchmarking on this that shows that given the annual spend across the UK of around about 110 billion a year in the real estate sector, something like 30 to 40 billion pounds worth of social value is available. And some of that's being caught at the moment, but a lot of it's being lost at the moment. And I think what we're going to show you today is a methodology for embedding social value into planning so we can unlock much more of that value. So I'm joined today by 3 amazing speakers. I'm going to hand over to Anna McChesney-Gordon in just a moment, who's the director of our consultancy business at Social Value Portal. Anna's then going to hand on to Phoebe Dennis, who's done a lot of work around the principles and the policy side of embedding social value into planning. And then I'm going to pass on to Ali. Ali's from Walthamstow Forest, and he is the social value lead at Walthamstow. He's going to talk from a local authority perspective, and then Anna's going to finish off, and then we're going to have a few questions. If you do have questions, or you want to, if you do have questions, you ask the panel, please drop them into the Q&A, and I'll be picking them up either during or probably at the end of this. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Anna, who's going to take us through the first slides. Anna, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen and make sure everything is working. Sorry, I know I need to flip that. There we go. Is that working okay?
Yes, it's fine now.
Lovely. Thank you. Hi, everybody, and thank you there for the introduction, guys. So as Guy said, I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview about social value more generally and how we measure it, our approach at Social Value Portal, and then a little bit of context about social value within real estate more generally, before I hand over to Phoebe and Ali to talk about planning specifically. So firstly, a bit of an introduction to who we actually are and social value, but I think it's important to kick things off with a definition of what social value actually is. I think it's quite easy for us who are in this world day in, day out to just assume that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet, and it's not quite the case. So definition that we generally put out there is that social value serves as an umbrella term for the wider economic, social, and environmental effects of an organization's activities and actions. So there's a couple of important things just to pull out from this, and that's firstly, that social value is very much the economic, social, and environmental benefits of activities and actions. And the most important word really in the sentence is wider, so the wider effects of an organization's activities and actions. So social value is all about capturing and measuring and reporting additionality and what organizations and different types of businesses are doing over and above their business as usual. So it's important just to bear that in mind as we speak over the next half an hour or so. So just a little bit of context about who we are. Social Value Portal, our whole aim is to help organizations measure, manage, and maximize organizations' broader contribution to society. So what is it that organizations are doing above and beyond, and how can they appropriately measure and report it? And we're called the Social Value Portal because first and foremost, we're a software as a service company with an online platform called the Portal, which can be used for that ongoing measurement, management, and reporting of social value. So our core services are around just those things. So that platform can be used for procurement, and it is used by lots of different public sector bodies for procurement, and actually more and more private sector organizations for their procurement as well. And then ultimately contract management once the procurement stage is complete, and reporting at all different stages. And then running through all of that is measurement. Being able to measure things and quantify things is integral to the way that we work, and we think it's really important to the way that people talk about social value and ultimately report it as well. So a question that we always get is, what's the difference between ESG and social value? And again, you would probably get quite a few different answers, different people that you ask, but this is how we think about it. So ESG as a concept is incredibly important. You need good ESG foundations to be a responsible and sustainable business. There's no doubt about it, but it is very much focusing about what's the negative, how can we minimize risk, how can we ensure we are being at least compliant. Whereas with social value, it's thinking more proactively about what the organization can do to contribute net positively to society. So what is it that we can do that will generate long-term outcomes and contribute to well-being of direct stakeholders as well as wider communities, and then society more widely, and the world more widely, in fact. So that's how the two things fit together. And I would always say that it's very difficult to have a strong and good social value strategy or approach unless you do have that good foundation within ESG. The two things certainly complement each other. So just a bit of context about the National Social Value Task Force. And I think it's important to share this because it shows the different stakeholders and organizations that are involved in the measurement of social value and have a stake in it. So several years ago, or 10 years ago, in fact, when the Social Value Act first came out, there was no real guidance in the legislation about how social value should be measured or quantified or reported consistently. So this National Social Value Task Force was created as a group a few years later, and it's still very much on the go at the moment, was created to put all heads together, different kinds of organizations from different sectors with different priorities and expertise, to think about what would a minimum measurement and reporting standard for social value look like, what should be included, how can we create an approach that's straightforward and people can get on board with, and it's robust and defensible and transparent. And this group and others along the way put their heads together and came up with the National Social Value Measurement Framework, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail in a second. But at the same time, this task force still comes together to push forward different initiatives and thinking about things in different sectors, developing up different pieces of guidance. And it's really, really useful and valuable to have those perspectives from different kinds of organizations. So it's a really valuable group to engage with and be able to work with. So I mentioned that minimum measurement and reporting standard for social value, and that is called the National TOMS for short, which stands for Themes, Outcomes and Measures. And this framework was first launched in 2017, and then it's had new iterations launched each year so that it's fully up to date and captures the core sort of policy objectives and things that are really important that have been raised by the task force and other organizations that are using the TOMS. So the whole point of the framework was to have something which is open source and accessible to all, so creates more of a level playing field for organizations who can end up actually comparing like for like when they are bidding for different contracts. It means that procuring organizations can compare like for like when they are awarding contracts. And ultimately, it allows for benchmarking, comparability, and reporting. And the framework can be downloaded from our website or the National Social Value Task Force website. So it's worth going to have a look at the full thing. But as you can imagine, it's quite difficult to capture in just one or two slides what the framework actually is. But we've tried to do that here. So I explained that the TOMS is built around themes, outcomes, and measures. And the themes, there are 5 of them, are really the things that should be important for any public sector body across the country, any responsible business, big or small, up and down the country. And that's around jobs and skills and employment, growth and responsible and local business, focusing on community wealth building. Social, the theme there about driving healthier, safer and more resilient communities. The environment, decarbonising and safeguarding our world. And then the 5th one is innovation, to make sure that organisations are always trying to do things that are not in this framework, which we absolutely want to encourage. It's supposed to be a minimum standard, but also making sure that people have the opportunity to share good practice and share how they are innovating in different ways. So there are several outcomes. There are 20 core outcomes within the national framework, and there's just a selection of them here. And there are several outcomes that sit underneath each of the themes. So at the top there within the jobs theme, you've got more opportunities for disadvantaged people, but there are also outcomes around more opportunities for local people, improved skills for young people, for example. And then, so there are a whole series of outcomes that sit under each of the themes. But to assess and measure whether those outcomes are being achieved, then you need something to measure. So there are a whole series of measures within the framework, things that can actually be counted and quantified using consistent set of units. So the example at the top there, within the outcome for more opportunities for disadvantaged people in the jobs theme, there is a measure around the number of ex-offenders employed, which is something that happens, it should happen more. It happens a lot within real estate, particularly within the main contractor world and other suppliers and contractors like that. But that's something that can create real value. And each of the measures has been assigned a proxy value, so a way to quantify in financial terms what the added value of that initiative or that measure being achieved. And that has been replicated 48 times within the national TOM, so that there are a whole series of measures and values which any organization can report against to see how they are generating added value and those added benefits. So again, just the example at the top about the ex-offender employed, there's a proxy value there of £23,119 per person. And that pulls together all sorts of public sector data sets around savings to the Ministry of Justice if that person is employed and not committing crime, savings to the local police service, savings to the NHS because people in work are less of a burden on the NHS, as well as economic benefits because those people are not claiming benefits, they are contributing economically to their local areas. All of those things feature within the proxy values of a measure like that around employment. Meanwhile, there are proxy values that are assigned to each of the other measures in there, so that you can start to build up a picture. If you've done 10 of something and 100 hours of something else, and you've saved 1,000 tons of carbon, then you can begin to report your social value in financial terms. And all of the proxy values that are within the framework are fully mapped out with all of the source data and all of the detail in there about how that figure has been arrived at, and that's all within the framework, which, as I mentioned, is publicly available. So that's a bit of context just about social value more generally, and now I just wanted to touch on a little bit of detail about social value within real estate. So the opportunity to generate social value throughout the real estate lifecycle is huge, and there are opportunities at lots of different stages. Obviously, today we're focusing on planning, but maximizing social value throughout the lifecycle really helps when you focus on it from the very beginning. So where should you actually invest? Where is it that you want to develop? How are you thinking about social value within design? Are you thinking about what is actually needed within the local area? Are you thinking about what you can incorporate into your design and plans to enable social value activities to happen long into the future after the construction phase is complete and people are actually working there or living there? Can social value be incorporated into planning and development? Absolutely, and Phoebe will talk in a little bit more detail about that. And then all of that supports social value within construction. And there's lots of tier 1 contractors and other smaller contractors who are really, really good at this stuff. And they're always thinking about the ways that they can go above and beyond just building something, and thinking about how they're doing it, who they're employing, how they're engaging with their local community and everything like that. And then ultimately, once a building is built, then the opportunity intensifies because there's then occupiers there, there is a full supply chain, there's a property management team, there might be residents who are there in that community in the long term. And there's a really interesting way of getting those different stakeholders to work together for the shared objective of generating social value within that area. And then reporting is really important throughout all of those phases, to be honest, to show the workings out, to show what commitments there are, what's being made there. And ultimately, if you measure and report on activity, then you're able to put a plan in place to improve and do more going forward. So I mentioned just before, but yes.
Sorry, just very quick. I'm just conscious of time. So
yeah, no problem. I've just got 2 more slides.
23 minutes past. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I mentioned just before that responding that social value is maximised when activities are focused on local needs, and there are all sorts of different ways to understand the local needs of an area. So firstly, there's plenty data out there that can help build up quite an objective overview of what the core needs and priorities are. You can use things like the indices of multiple deprivation. There's all kinds of data about health and well-being, about the impact of COVID on an area. But really, nothing beats actually speaking to people and engaging with people. So you can ensure that any social value strategy is actually informed by what people say is important to you. And there are different ways of doing that, either in person or obviously as a response to COVID. Lots of that was done online in recent times as well. So this is just second last slide here. A few things that are kind of driving forward the social value conversation within real estate, and there's a lot of great stuff out there. Phoebe will talk about the paper on the right hand side there, but there's also some brilliant documents from the UK Green Building Council as well, which we can direct you to after this. And then in terms of responses, there is some really great stuff happening across the life cycle. So organizations thinking about what they're doing corporately, like Landsec in the middle there, what can be done on specific developments, thinking about social value within planning, thinking about social value within the operational asset and the portfolio more widely. So there's a lot of great stuff out there, and happy to share some links for you after this. But I'll finish there and let Phoebe talk in a bit more detail about social value in planning.
Thanks very much, Anna. Could you just go to the next slide, please? So I'm just going to share a little bit more detail really around the work that we've been doing looking at embedding social value in planning. So I think Guy already mentioned that kind of all kicked off about 18 months ago now, when we launched the Planning Task Force. So the Planning Task Force is a subgroup of the National Social Value Task Force that Anna mentioned. And really all of the organisations that you can see on the screen now that are part of the Planning Task Force came together 18 months ago, wanting to think more about how do we effectively embed social value in the planning process so that more social value can be delivered across the life cycle of a development. But importantly, how do we embed social value in the planning process in a way that works for all stakeholders that are involved? So you can see from kind of the logos on the screen, we've got quite a mix in the task force of public and private sector organisations, also working with some consultants and some planning lawyers. So we've really been able to kind of learn from lots of different perspectives of people that are involved in the planning process, to really think about how to move forward with a solution in a way that works for everyone. So when we started this group, we wanted to focus on 3 work streams. So one of the key things that we wanted to think about in this task force was, how do we create planning policy from a local authority perspective, whereby they actually create the requirement for social value submissions to form part of a planning application? So really thinking about what type of policy guidance is out there or could we put out there, and are there any examples of good practice where local authorities have already embedded social value in their planning policy? We then had another working group looking at benefit realisation. So going a step further and thinking about, okay, once we've created this planning policy context where a local authority is able to actually request social value as part of the planning submission, how do we then make sure that any social value commitments that are being made at planning are actually then going to be delivered to the communities throughout the various stages of a development life cycle? And then the third working group was really thinking about what's already happening. Are there examples of good practice at the moment that are going above and beyond kind of policy requirement to show that actually developers and contractors and delivery partners do have the ability to deliver really great social value across all stages of the development life cycle? And luckily the answer was yes, and we were able to find lots of great case studies. So Anna, if you could just go to the next slide, please. Really, the main kind of output from the planning task force to date has been the Embedding Social Value into Planning briefing paper. So this briefing paper essentially brings together those 3 work streams in a document that provides guidance for embedding social value in planning for both the English planning context, but also looking at the Welsh planning policy context, which differs slightly. So we've got 2 documents which are available, and I will pop the link in the chat once I've kind of finished presenting, so that you can download those from our website if you want kind of some more information. But essentially what these 2 documents really importantly show is that all parties that are involved in the planning process have a clear desire and a way to work together to embed social value in the planning process. And this will support levelling up, helping communities recover, delivering better places to live, and really importantly, rebuilding that trust that Guy mentioned at the start was really lacking in the planning process between public sector, developers and communities. So the guidance that is covered in these documents is for public and private sector. So guidance for councils on the different options that they have to actually embed social value in their planning policy, as well as guidance for developers on how they would actually respond effectively to that type of requirement as part of their planning application. And then finally, really examples to illustrate the good practice that is already existing in the built environment sector in terms of delivering social value over and above planning policy compliance. So if you go to the next slide, please, Anna. If you take a look at these 2 briefing papers, and as I'm kind of talking through the next few slides, you'll notice that a lot of the kind of language we're using and a lot of the work was structured around this ability to create a requirement for social value through planning applications. And really this takes the form in what we call a social value statement. So a social value statement essentially is to demonstrate that the developer has actually understood the local needs of an area and are making a clear commitment at the planning stage to actually address those needs through measurable outcomes relating to social value. So this has many benefits, but I think the 2 really important ones to highlight are firstly, that it will improve transparency, which is lacking in the planning system oftentimes. And this is through really providing clear social value commitments, which can then be measured and managed across a development life cycle. But secondly, it really provides an important opportunity for the local community to actually be involved in influencing a planning application. So community consultation should be really key to feeding into a place-based social value strategy and ultimately summarised in a social value statement. And interestingly, quite recently, Southwark Council have looked to be putting a social value statement on their validation checklist, but they've specifically said that this social value statement should be recognising how community consultation has fed into the development of a social value strategy. So they're really clearly emphasising the importance between community consultation and the creation of a social value statement. So a social value statement as a document should really include the following kind of key chapters. So a policy review is a really important step, and this is really to recognise what are the challenges and opportunities according to the local council to create social value in that area. This can be bolstered with the local needs analysis, so really looking at what does the data tell you, considering the local needs and priorities for an area, and how should you then address those is where you answer this in the social value measurement framework and the social value action plan. So those 2 things are really where you start to build up a set of measures that relate to social value that you know are going to be relevant to address the needs in the local area, and then actually start to make specific commitments against targets which can be attributed to different phases of the development life cycle. So right from design all the way through to occupation and estate management. Next slide, please, Anna. So kind of circling back to the briefing paper, the really key finding when we're thinking about planning policy in terms of embedding social value is that the most effective and robust way to actually embed social value in planning policy is through updating the local plan to include social value. But we know that oftentimes this isn't going to be kind of a quick fix. The local plan can take several years to actually develop and be adopted. And if a council finds themselves in the position where this isn't really a logical next step, we also found that there's other ways that actually a local authority can create a robust policy context to require social value prior to actually updating the local plan. So I'll go through a little bit more detail on that in the next slide. So within the document, as I said, we kind of lay out key recommendations for public and private sector. So I'll move on to private sector in just a second, but when we're thinking about our key recommendations for public sector, this is really focused on creating that policy context to require social value. So as I said, embedding it in the local plan is a really effective way of doing that. But if that's not going to be an easy kind of route immediately, then actually a local authority can choose to create or update a social value policy so that this specifically relates to things like the health and wellbeing strategy in England or the wellbeing plan in Wales. And actually in doing that, you are creating a robust planning policy context to be able to require social value. There's also another option, so it doesn't apply in all cases, but if a development does fall within the environmental impact assessment requirements, then a council can actually choose to scope social value into this extended reporting regime and actually create the requirement for a social value statement through that way. But obviously that's not going to apply kind of every time. So updating the local plan or updating a social value policy would also be preferable. Once you've created that policy context with either the local plan or the social value policy, updating the validation checklist is then kind of the final step in making that really robust requirement. So if you're adding something to the validation list, that means that it has to be submitted as part of a major planning application. So it's a really robust way of making sure that that does happen. And then the next step, once that policy context has been created, would be to think about actually, can we contractualize some elements of social value submissions to ensure that they are actually going to be delivered. So this can be using things like Section 106 or planning obligations or planning conditions. And the briefing paper goes into a lot more detail about kind of where those things are most suitable and which might be the most appropriate use in different contexts. So moving on to our key recommendations for private sector. So really when we're recommending private sector embed social value in planning, we really need to think about how to do this in the most effective way to make sure that local needs are being met. So of course, the first step, which is really important, is to understand local needs. So I won't go into too much detail as Anna already covered kind of the local needs analysis process, but that's a really fundamental first step for creating any social value strategy. And then secondly, which is also really important, is involving the community in this process. So giving them the opportunity to actually feed their own insights into your research to then create the social value strategy that reflects their kind of challenges and aspirations for the area as well. Thirdly, including measurable outcomes and also committing to regular reporting are two really crucial elements to make sure that the developer is actually being held accountable to the commitments that they're making, but also just being transparent in order to build trust with communities and with the local authority to really make sure that people are confident that they will be delivering against their social value commitments and that the benefits will be realised for the local area. And then finally, agreeing a remediation schedule. So this really links back to the idea around contractualising some elements of social value. So if the local authority has chosen to do this, the developer should also agree to a remediation schedule for any of those social value commitments that are contractualised. So what that really means is for any instances where the developer is actually not able to deliver something that they previously said that they would deliver, for example, a certain number of apprenticeships on a development scheme, they should then actually be agreeing to potentially a financial remediation payment to the council in case of non-delivery, so that the council can actually then use those funds and go forward to create those apprenticeship opportunities that were initially promised. So really all about making sure that that value is realised in the local community when it's being committed in a planning application. And then onto my final slide, which is really just looking at what's happening now. So as I mentioned, the briefing paper was launched over summer. And since then, we've actually seen already lots of organisations that we work with through the task force looking at embedding social value in their planning policy in different ways. So we've got several at the top there that are looking to embed social value in their new local plan. So they were actually, at a time frame where they could do this. Others are choosing to include social value in supplementary planning documents. And finally, I did already mention Southwark, but we've also got Bristol City Council who are looking to add social value into the validation checklist. So a few different routes that different local authorities are taking to actually create that requirement. So I'll now pass on to Ali from Waltham Forest, so you can see their logo is on there anyway, to just discuss what they're doing in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Phoebe. So yeah, Anna, if you'd like to go to the next slide, please. So I just want to talk about our current social value journey and how it is at present. Just over a year and a half ago, we adopted the National TOMS framework, which Anna and Phoebe both went into about our themes, outcomes and measures on how we capture social value. So we adopted the framework. We also built a strong partnership with the Social Value Portal. This is our single reporting framework for capturing social value on all of our projects within the borough. We have created development of a bespoke social value framework, and at present, where we're looking to embed social value into planning, we have social value embedded in all of our procurement contracts, and we work very closely with the procurement teams to ensure social value is embedded in a way that's necessary or appropriate to a contract, whether it is a full list of measures depending on the contract value, or a sort of light measure, which is something like a cash donation or in-kind contribution, which is also managed by the Social Value Fund. Around about less than a year ago, actually, in September last year, a social value function was created in the council and it was approved by cabinet. So that will be my role, my colleagues and my manager, who was already in place a year before that. Social value has really grown within Waltham Forest. I mean, it's grown nationwide, but specifically talking about Waltham Forest, it's really grown on the agenda for our internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders. On the back of the pandemic, COVID-19 has affected a lot of our residents, whether it is their well-being, their mental health, and a lot of other issues that have caused them to have redundancies from their work and things like that. So on the back of that, the council has published a public service strategy, which was in November in 2020, which sort of gave an emergency action on what we can do to support our residents, and part of that was included in there was social value and how we can improve people's lives by looking into employment and skills, creating better places, and how we can work closely with our developers to meet community needs. We also had and approved by cabinet just over a year ago, it was a social value policy. And this is a little snapshot of our social value policy on this slide here with our corporate council priorities. Next slide, please. 2022 and beyond, we're looking to refresh our social value policy. So this will include more environmental aspects. We're working very closely with our environmental teams at the council to see how we can become more net carbon. And we will also look to move on to embedding social value into our local plan, as Phoebe mentioned in her slides. We did look at embedding social value previously onto an SPD, the supplementary planning document, but then looking at a previous local plan, it didn't cite social value in there. So it was proven to be quite challenging to include any sort of social value with a bit of weight in there. But with the refreshment and the perfect timing of a local plan coming this year, we're going to include a very strong stance on social value and how we can create a strong collaboration between social value and planning teams, as well as Section 106 contractual obligations. Part of my role and my priority within the council is to create better cohesion between our planning teams, our employment, business and skills teams, to ensure social value is being educated and delivered appropriately internally as well as externally to our stakeholders. We hold a stance that social value and Section 106 are they do work separately, but I'm trying to work a better collaboration between the two. So, as you know, Section 106 being the planning obligation, social value being the additional over and above core contract requirements. Next slide, please. I've just created a little visual here on what is our motivation to embed social value into planning. So the first step would be to raise awareness. I touched on this earlier. So it's more or less educating our internal and external stakeholders on what social value is, because there's a lot of crossover between social value and Section 106. And I see this come across quite a lot of times with our developers, particularly in construction. And what we want to do is to make sure both of them are clearly defined. There's some sort of differentiation between the definitions of what a local person is or what a local business is in the borough. So we just want to clearly define what both are to internally and externally to our stakeholders. The second stage is making it bespoke. So embedding social value into planning is something that is high on our priority, well, my priority in terms of my role with the council. And making a bespoke plan for social value within the council ensures that there's a unique approach to capturing and embedding social value within a contract or a project within the borough. And we've done this, or we're actually doing this currently within our procurement processes. And we create bespoke social value delivery plans for high profile projects, such as at the moment with the Walthamstow Town Hall. On the back of pre-pandemic, there was a social value delivery plan agreed. And as you know, COVID happened. So it did affect a lot of commitments that were made, but then we could go back into that delivery plan and create something that is a bit more in line with what the priorities are in the borough at that present time, especially post-pandemic. So that's just a little example of how we made something bespoke. Collaboration. I did mention about working closely with our employment, business and skills teams. They head up the Section 106 for our developers and suppliers within the borough. And I work very closely with them to include social value as a sort of starting conversation for our developers. It is already agreed in procurement, but us including in conversations within planning ensures that there's a clear definition and a clear message that's being sent across to our stakeholders. Development. So this is something we will be working on later this year. There will be a refreshment of the local plan where we would look as a council to embed social value into our planning document, specifically the local plan, so that we can have a strong stance on social value all round, whether it is procurement or the planning side of things. Lastly, and this is probably one of the most important steps, is execution. Contract management and execution of projects where all these measures or all these commitments are put into place, and we can actually see something that is being delivered through local jobs, local apprenticeships, the promotion and local spend of local businesses and SMEs in the borough. Next slide, please. So my final slide is our 3 ways of maximizing the value and social impact of every local spend. So we have 3 different steps. So one being social impact through design and commissioning. This is as specified in the specification and core contract requirements. We also have social impact. So this will be Section 106. This is in planning policy requirements. It is driven by planning requirements for a developer, and it's their obligation to meet those measures if they want to build on our land. The one that I want to touch on the most, and it is my dedicated function, is social value. So we promote social value to our contractors and our external stakeholders as something that's driven by the contractor and them, because they pick between the suite of measures of how they want to commit to social value on their contract or project. And that's how it differs to something like Section 106, where it's sort of fixed and it's in the planning requirements of their obligation, whereas social value, they can pick in terms of how they want to maximize the social impact on their projects. And this is where we like to keep it. As a council, we are not going to obligate social value, but we will work in strong collaboration with the other teams to ensure that there's a strong stance internally to our external stakeholders. Thank you. I think that's my last slide.
Great, thanks, Ali. I just wanted to close with, and it will just be a couple of minutes, with a case study about Sulfur Crescent, which just shows the art of the possible, albeit on an absolutely vast scale, but it just gives some interesting concepts and shows the approach. So a couple of years ago, we were appointed by the English Cities Fund and the University of Manchester and Salford City Council to develop a social value strategy for the redevelopment of Salford, and for a scheme called the Crescent, or Sulfur Crescent. So a large part of that was community consultation. So I touched on needs analysis earlier and said there's nothing better than speaking to real local people about what's important to them, so that they know and we know that the social value strategy is responding to what they say matters. So we used a whole different sort of suite of tools for this, but one of them was a site called Social Pinpoint, where we created a social value map and an ideas wall where people could make pins with specific things that they wanted to address, or ideas that they have, or if they wanted to say, there's a really great community group located right here that I think is really valuable and I just want you to know about, for example. At the same time, there was several different workshops that were done specifically for young people. There were skills development sessions for local businesses, and there was a young people's survey. And the reason why there was such a focus on young people was because the initial needs analysis and the work that was done looking at the public sector data, and by speaking to the council, it was clear that there was a real need to create more opportunities for the young people in the area so that they would want to stay, live and work in Salford. So as a result, there was the Sulfur Crescent Academy that was created. So we partnered with an organisation called Placed, who are brilliant at understanding what the needs are of an area and running different kinds of sessions and workshops to help understand where the opportunities lie, what's needed and how to actually get there. So they have the Placed Academy, which works in a few different areas, but they also ran some sessions within Salford as well. So you can see a quote on the right-hand side there from Amelia, who had done the session. And there's all kinds of great stats here from the impact pages of their website. But if you have a look at Placed Academy on Google, then you'll see all sorts of additional stuff that you could read about that. So finally, what we did and what we were tasked with initially, and over the course of about a year, we developed up the social value strategy for the Crescent, and that included all kinds of ideas and recommendations and commitments that English Cities Fund and the University of Salford and Salford City Council should look to deliver and unlock throughout the life cycle of the scheme. So there was expected to be 10 to 15 years of development work, and then several hundred years of occupation that follows. So the opportunity was huge, and we also created a social value policy for the suppliers and occupiers as well. So the supply chain for a scheme like that is absolutely huge, and the opportunities that they have to generate outcomes and benefits is massive. And then not forgetting the occupier base and the tenant base, who are going to be probably living in the area as well, but working there day in, day out. They have a big part to play and a big opportunity to generate outcomes for the local area and contribute to that overall strategy. So now we work with the English Cities Fund to actually measure, monitor, manage and report the activity that is underway. So there'll be all sorts of new reports and things that we're able to publish, and case studies, and lots to learn for the next one as well. So that's it. Just wanted to finish on a case study, so I'll just drop my screen.
Thanks very much, Hannah, Phoebe and Ali. We've got another sort of just over 15 minutes to chat. I'm going to sort of run some questions, but if anyone on the call in the audience has any questions, please drop them into the Q&A and I'll pick them up as I go through. I'm going to start off with you, Ali, if I may. I love your A, B, C, D, E. We often see it trying to get words to fit into the alphabet or word. I think yours works really well. I might even steal it. Of course I would. I didn't say that live, did I? Anyway, I thought it was really good. So, and it kind of described your motivation, but tell me what your, within planning compared to procurement, because your role is both in procurement and planning. How do you see planning now driving it, and what's the message you want to get out to, you know, the developers and designers who are coming to work in Waltham Forest?
The message I want to make to specifically to planners and developers is that social value is just as important as Section 106. I'm of the viewpoint that it differs to it, but there are crossovers with both. But I just want to stress how important social value is in terms of how it can improve communities, businesses, and the environment. In my case, in the borough.
Yeah, and so you're not driving it from a kind of, okay, we want extra out of the developers. You're driving it from the right place, which is really looking after the communities and helping rebuild that trust. Yeah,
absolutely.
Right. Okay, that's really good. And you can see that movement picking up across other local authorities across the country. You get a sense of that?
Especially from attending the task force meeting, I can see a lot of good motivation and how strong social value is on the agenda within those boroughs too.
That's great. Thanks, Ali. And just sticking with Section 106, Phoebe, you know, we know that contractualization of social value is going to be a big issue. And I think that probably it's fair to say that certainly in the work we're doing is that some local authorities are contractualizing it and others are not. Some developers are happy to do that and others are not. And then we've also not only seen Section 106, we've seen conditions being used. What's your sort of general thought about how Section 106 should be used, if at all?
Well, I think when we're talking about the types of things that relate to social value and would fall under Section 106, we're often thinking about the employment and skills requirements, which oftentimes are already being contractualized, but perhaps haven't traditionally been also viewed as social value and things that create social value. I don't think it should be shied away from being contractualized, because actually oftentimes developers are already, you know, very capable of providing local employment opportunities and supporting apprenticeships on developments. It just might not previously have been badged as social value or included in a social value submission for planning. So I think it's a good idea, where possible, to actually contractualize those types of things, just to make sure that it is actually being delivered, and to make sure that there's trust between the developer, the local authority, and the community, to actually feel confident that what goes into a social value statement in planning is definitely going to actually be delivered as added value for the community.
And Anna, I mean, just picking up on that, I mean, what Phoebe mentioned there was, making sure that what's promised during planning is actually developed. Can you just talk to us, and you touched briefly on the needs analysis and linking with communities, and we've got this overarching theme of kind of trust. Can you just sort of perhaps talk a little bit about, in a bit more detail, the process we follow, or you think should be followed in terms of needs, and linking needs with the measurement framework, and just why that is so important?
Yes, definitely. And just on the contractual piece, it's not really any different to a bidder making social value commitments during a procurement and then not being held to account for what they said they were going to do. So it seems logical to make sure that it's contractualized in one way or another, without being sort of too strict about it. But so I think the thing with local needs is that to make social value really valuable, any activities and commitments that are delivered should respond to the local needs and priorities of the area where the development, in this case, or where the project is happening. Because what is valuable in a scheme in Newcastle city centre will be a little bit different to what is valuable to a scheme in the Kent countryside. And there'll be lots of things that will be useful and create good outcomes regardless of geography. But it's important that thought goes into what the commitments are going to be, so that they are actually more meaningful. And you can think about, what is it that this community actually needs, rather than doing things just for the sake of doing them. It also helps with getting communities involved and engaged within a scheme as well. So when there's consultation happening, there's obviously statutory consultation, which will happen in lots of cases, but when there's other consultation happening, you have the opportunity to get those communities and those people or stakeholders involved in setting a very long-term social value strategy for their area. They can then feel involved. You can begin to build up that trust and that communication network with them as well. And if they think that stuff is just being done to them, then they'll not be as engaged or as welcome about things. So it's important to collaborate and make sure stuff is being done kind of with them and for them.
And you spoke about the TOMs, and we'll come to the question in a moment that Paul's asked. I don't know whether you're going to answer that, Hannah, or I should, but we'll come to that in just a moment, Paul. How important, Anna, do you think it is, or rather, I'll ask it a different way, but where does the valuation of social value sit within the planning process? I mean, we use it in procurement because it's used to help decide which offer, in bid has the most value. But why do you think it's important in the planning process, and in particular, sort of within, the planning, the cabinet, the council cabinet who's looking at planning? Is it sort of, what part does it play, do you think?
Well, yeah, I think that for anyone within the local authority planning team or within the cabinet making these decisions, it just helps paint part of the picture about the value that is being generated through a scheme. So we are an advocate of putting proxy values and financial values onto activities and commitments, because it helps talk about value in a different way, but in a way that people understand. Everyone understands the value of a pound, but it's just part of the picture. You also need to think about feedback and communication, testimonials and quotes from local people who are going to be impacted, or local businesses or communities, or a community group or charity who have been supported. Capturing a case study and a testimonial from that group will help to paint the sort of overall picture of the value of something.
So it's about scaling as well, yeah. It's understanding the scale of it.
Well, I think so, and it gets people thinking. wow, that's a lot of social value that's being committed here. I wonder what commitments sit behind that, and then people might read the detail. I think if a social value statement led with, there's going to be a lot of value generated.
And typically, what is that? What's as a percentage of the construction value? What does that look like? A lot.
I mean, it ranges, but what we see as a bit of a benchmark would be around 20%, sometimes 30% of the construction spend on a scheme. So it's huge amounts. If there's £100 million being spent on something, it's 20-30 million pounds of social value that is there to be created, but also means it's there to be lost if you don't have a strategy or a plan in place.
And I guess, Ali, just picking up on that, and we're just talking about the framework, the TOMS framework, which offers some form of standardization. I'll answer Paul's question directly after this. But why do you think the TOMS provide that? And just talk about the values that you're seeing, whether it's procurement or in construction, if you've had that construction experience. Where do you sit on that, Ali?
I see the larger sort of social value commitments coming from the construction sector, as Anna mentioned, and specifically looking at the TOMS, with the sort of employment and local spend is where the highest proxy values are, especially when they're localized to our borough. And I do see that there's a lot of our external stakeholders, when making commitments, specifically against these TOMS, they do include these measures within their commitments, and it's nice to see, because this is something they want to upskill and improve the livelihoods of the communities and get them involved with a project in the borough, which is something they can be proud of. So I think it's very, very important.
And you use the same framework across planning and also procurement, yeah?
Yes, we will be. Yes.
Yeah, it's a standardization. Just to answer that question, Paul. So the TOMS is actually a standardized framework, in as much that there's a sort of, they're all referenced, and there's, we have a core set of about 40, and those are the same whether you're in Leeds or in London, or come to that, across in Bristol. In terms of the BSI, there is a BS for social value, and the TOMS is referenced in that, but the BS remains, it's a very high level framework, but the TOMS framework has been picked up and endorsed by councils and many developers around the country. So it's becoming a kind of default solution, in all honesty. There's about 100 councils using it across the country, and many beginning to look at it in planning as well. Phoebe, can I jump to you, please, just in terms of the challenges, and I'm kind of interested in what your advice would be to a developer. So plainly, whilst there is some leading local authorities that are now embedding social value into planning and beginning to look at it, and, there's a handful in truth, aren't there? There's less than 10. Nonetheless, do you think it's a good idea that developers and consultants who might be on the call should start looking at this and should do a social value statement anyway? I mean, what's the point of doing that, do you think, even though it's not necessarily required yet?
Yeah, good point. I mean, in terms of submitting a social value statement with a planning application, whether it's part of a policy requirement or not, there's so many benefits outside of just planning policy compliance. So it's really crucial in basically demonstrating the additional benefits of a scheme. So particularly where a developer is concerned with engaging effectively with the local community, it's one really important way that local community can be engaged throughout the pre-planning submission process and also post-planning submission, to have discussions with the developer about how they can actually interact with that social value strategy for a scheme. So whether that be them being able to provide input before that strategy is developed, so highlighting what the local needs and priorities are for themselves, or whether that be after that statement's been submitted and they can interact with that document and make suggestions about how different social value commitments can actually be delivered in the community. it's a really useful way for the developer to have that positive engagement, but also to actually get local people interested in development and actually come into the space and use it, depending on what type of development is actually being built. If it's going to be an area with, a public realm, a social value strategy is a really great way to make sure that the local community can be engaged in using that space in a really effective way for a long time after the construction period is actually over. So I guess in the long and short, engaging with the community, but also, just rebuilding that trust.
And could you just, for a minute or two, we've done a design guide for social value, and whilst we are going to have a separate session on that, could you just sort of briefly tell people what that is, and perhaps you can share the link in a moment for the design guide as well?
Yes, I'll drop that in the link. So just in short, to kind of summarise, separate to the planning task force, we also have a design task force, which is a group of professionals working in design, all thinking about how to actually embed social value in the design process as a design team. So on one hand, thinking about actually ways that social value can be integrated into the way that things are designed and the way that spaces are going to be used, but also recognising that as a design team, you are a group of people that have an opportunity to create social value yourselves through providing job opportunities, providing training opportunities, supporting local community projects. So there's lots of ways that social value can be embedded in design and create more value through a scheme at that really early stage. So we have a separate guide on that, which I will just drop in the chat now.
Great, thank you. And we've got a comment from, not sure who it is actually, but fundamental aim for climate change is improving the quality of life in your work on social value. And actually, I'll ask Anna and Ali on this. I mean, the TOMS as a measurement framework is great, it tells you values, but what's the link, do you think, with, in the first instance, climate change, which I know you answer really quickly, but more difficult is the link to quality of life. So, Anna, do you want to pick that up, and then Ali, you follow on?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned at the beginning, social value, very much social, economic and environmental value. So any social value strategy that we would be developing covers those three elements. So we want to ensure that developers, consultants, contractors are always thinking about what they are doing, how they're doing it, and how they might be able to reduce the impact on the environment there. In terms of quality of life, I think there's such a big part to play when I was just having a conversation earlier about my energy bill from the last month, and I think that it's quite scary when you think about the energy prices and what it costs to run a home. And thankfully we're just coming out of winter, although it is pouring with rain outside. But I think that anything that can be done to think about the long-term use of buildings and how they interact with them and how they can be more sustainable, not just in terms of the environment, but helping people live and work in them in a more sustainable and economical way is really important. And we're always trying to make sure that the latest guidance and the ideas that come out are fed into our work wherever possible.
And Ali, where do you see it, social value playing into quality of life of the citizens of Waltham Forest?
I see it playing a very big part. Just giving an example of one of our projects within Leabridge, there was a resident consultation meeting, and a lot of the feedback received was for a sort of, in the area, having a community hub for young people, but then likewise having the same hub used for elderly people who suffer from loneliness as a result of the COVID pandemic. So looking at how it can improve quality of life, we've reached out to the developer, who was also present at the event, to ensure that we create this community hub and make it tailored towards these audiences, because this is the feedback we received the most. And I think it's a great example of how we can improve the quality of life just by those two demographics. But we're also looking borough-wide on how we can improve quality of life in other areas as well.
That's great. There's final comment really from the chat. Anna, this one's for you actually. Jake has said or questioned whether or not in the government property agency working, they're doing office hubs. I know central government has been slow to the party, but I think they've brought out construction playbook. Is that right? That social value features in it. Do you want to just tell people about that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, as Guy said, we haven't engaged with government property agency yet, but we will definitely want to. But construction playbook has got all sorts of advice and guidance for organizations looking to incorporate social value into the way that they do things. And when you couple that with the social value model, which is the other social value guidance, which is relevant for central government, there are all kinds of policy objectives and outcomes that you can look to achieve through the way you do things. But we'll definitely have a look at government property agencies.
And I think there's a 10% minimum weighting, isn't there, on procurement for all construction?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Good. Okay, look, we're running to an end, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to sum up sort of, I guess, what do you want to see? Let's fast forward. I mean, we're 10 years into the Social Value Act, and let's not be ambitious, go too far ahead. So we won't go to 2032, but let's go 5 years ahead, so 2027. Where do you want to be, do you think, with respect to planning? I'll start with Ali, and then Phoebe, and then Anna. Ali, where do you want to be in 5 years' time on this, of Waltham Forest?
I would like to see members of the planning teams becoming strong advocates for social value. Their knowledge on it is very brief at the moment, but I would like to see in a few years' time for them to know it in and out and become strong advocates of what social value is and the impact it has.
Great, thanks, Ali. Phoebe.
I guess in terms of planning policy and public sector, I think 5 years is a very ideal time frame in terms of thinking about local plans being developed. So I definitely want to see a lot more local authorities having social value embedded in their local plan, but additionally on a more kind of strategic level as well. So seeing things like the new London plan coming through and also embedding social value in that type of kind of strategic planning level as well is really important to set kind of the bar.
Great. And Anna, your message to developers, I think.
Yeah, well, mine was going to be to developers anyway, which is just my hope would be that it doesn't become a tick boxy thing. It's really not what social value is all about. We want people to take it seriously and think deeply about what it is that they could do that could generate the best outcomes and the long-term benefit. And it might not be millions and millions and millions of pounds of social value. That's the big figure doesn't necessarily equate to the biggest value. So thinking about what would actually have the biggest impact is really important. So figuring out the local needs and what you can do that's genuinely meaningful and not thinking of it as an annoying add-on that you have to do within your planning application, but a really, really core part of it.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much to everyone, my panelists, Anna, Ali and Phoebe. Really good discussion, and thanks for such quality presentations as well. As I mentioned, this is the first of a series of ESG or BCO ESG webinars we're going to be doing. Watch this space, lots of stuff coming up. We're really all about upskilling the BCO membership so they really get and understand what ESG is all about, or social value, to coin or to pick up what Anna said earlier. So with that, I'm going to let you all go back to your day jobs. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good rest of the afternoon and a good rest of the week, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Good afternoon.